Bienvenidos al club. Aquí estamos de nuevo en una nueva entrega especial. Ya sabéis que van avanzando los playoffs, os lo seguimos contando. Ya tenemos un equipo clasificado para segunda ronda, una barrida. Y es que los Celtics se han llevado por delante a los Nets. De eso hablaremos en otro momento. Hoy tenemos un especial, ya sabéis que me gusta mucho hablar con la gente al otro lado del charco. Hoy ni más ni menos que Chris Herring. Aquí comienza el capítulo 407 de NBAdictos. Good afternoon, Chris. Welcome to NBAdictos.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. I guess it's probably not afternoon there, though, is it?
Yes, it's 7 in the afternoon.
Okay, got you. Okay.
It's 6 hours more than the New York time. I don't know if you are in Chicago or in New York.
I'm in Chicago.
Because you are from Chicago, right?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So maybe our I don't know how to say sintonía, the music that would put for the show. Maybe it sounds familiar to you because Carlos Bayona, the brother of the filmmaker Juan Antonio Bayona, is a huge Chicago Bulls fan, and he made us this song with the announcer with Jordan that game against Utah.
I could hear it in the background, yeah, and I remember that sequence very well. Just as a young Bulls fan, and as as an NBA writer that pays a lot of attention to those years.
Mm-hmm. You work for Sports Illustrated. Previously, you've been in ESPN, in Wall Street Journal, but we have you here because of this book, Blood in the Garden, the Flagrant History of the 1990s New York Knicks. I have to confess that I think I'm a little bit older than you. I'm from 1980. I started following the NBA with Magic Johnson and when I was a little boy, those Showtime Lakers, and I was a fan like a boy of the coach then Pat Riley, but I didn't knew so much about his way of coaching. And when when he went to New York, it's like I kind of forget him. And later I read, I saw documentaries about those Showtime Lakers, and I learned a little bit. But I was shocking with this book and with Riley. But first of all, that we start with the book and the history of this Knicks. I'm wondering how much work is after this book. How many months, maybe years, you spent working? Because you did a lot of interviews. You spoke with a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a difficult process. Because I think a lot of people, when you talk about writing a book, I think a lot of people just think that you just sit down and you just start writing. But as you know from having read the book, you need a lot of information to write it. And some of that information you can find by watching YouTube or by getting books from the library or by buying the books and by reading magazines. But if you only get information from those places, you're only going to have information that people have already found out before because they've read those books, because they've watched those YouTube clips, because they've seen that history happen and they remember reading those things. So you have to spend a lot of time, like you said, interviewing the people involved, and not just the people that everyone knows Patrick Ewing, Pat Riley, John Starks, but a lot of the people behind the scenes that nobody knew their names,
Hmm.
because those are going to be people that have really good stories that they've never been interviewed about before. So I interviewed, I think, 204 people.
Ooh.
Um, I agreed to do this book back in basically December of 2018. So I started the book really a little bit more than 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago.
Hmm.
It took me almost exactly 2.5 years to write, which it doesn't always take that long to do. It did take 2.5 years to write, but it took 2.5 years from when I agreed to do it and do all the interviewing and all the
Hmm.
research
All the
and then
process.
writing it. The process took about 2.5 years. Um, it doesn't always need to take that long. I think there were a couple things that in my process that slowed it down. One, it was my first time writing a book, so I think that
Hmm.
that challenge is a little bit difficult just because you're trying to figure out, how to make the book read well and how to make it flow and how to make sure that it's not boring and that it has enough details and that you don't reveal certain details too early. But I think the bigger challenge too is I have a full time job writing about the NBA, and again, just like with the book, where you can't just write the really obvious basic stuff. You have to
Hmm.
watch the games and you have to spend time interviewing the players, and that takes work to do that. Especially, I'm not covering one team; I cover the whole league. So watching a lot of games and having to write about those things intelligently takes a lot of attention away from the book. So I was working on two things at once. So it took about 2.5 years to do, and it was definitely the most difficult thing I've ever done work wise.
And also a little pandemia.
And the pandemic, which took, I feel like, all of us at least a few months to get used to. I don't know if it really hurt the book because in some ways maybe it made it easier. As I was just saying before, I had a full time job to work
Hmm.
on the NBA stuff full time. So when that happened, it did obviously stop the NBA for several months, which probably gave me more time. Now I still had to work and write about the pandemic for my
Hmm.
job, and I started to write about the NBA for my job even during the pandemic. But that's not normal to just have 3 or 4 months where you don't have NBA games to watch. You don't have NBA material that you're responsible for. So it was probably helpful, but I also think that it was stressful to be in the middle of a pandemic where you don't know what's happening, where you live in the country where it's where you're dealing with the highest infection rates and the most deaths and everything else. It's a little bit nerve wracking to deal with that and stressful. And you're worried about family. You're worried about yourself. You don't know whether you can go to the store and be safe.
Hmm.
So it was helpful, but I do think that there were a couple months there where it was challenging day to day just to try to figure out your mind isn't really in a space where you want to do work because you're
Hmm.
worried about the state of the world and everything else. So, but it probably was a while.
Hmm. I also heard you in beginning with Coach Thorpe saying that maybe all this Zoom situation help you with some people that maybe will say, "Oh, I can sit with you and talk. I'm in at
Right.
home. Okay, I'm at home too. Let's Zoom it." No?
Yeah, oh, it made it easier from that standpoint. Like it definitely, when you've got 200 people, more than 200 people that you're trying to get in touch with, um, I knew I was able to tell very quickly whether people had any interest in talking to me at all. If they didn't want to talk, it didn't become something where I had to chase them 14 times or try to find a bunch of different phone numbers for them. I could
Mhm.
find out pretty quickly because, like I said, if you get their cell phone number, you get their home phone number, and they're just not returning calls or not returning emails, there's only so many places they could be. Some people are wealthy and have a lot of money and maybe have vacation homes and stuff like that. But in today's day and age, you could find time to get back to someone, especially
Mhm.
again over 2 years of me working on the book. It was pretty easy to track me down if people wanted to get back in touch with me. So yeah, that was definitely helpful for sure.
And also, you said it before. You started with that. Let me say, invisible people. That people that are always around, but sometimes we don't see. That they bring you some staff with which work with in order to later talk with, for example, Gundy or another people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was something where some of them were really, really helpful. Certain people I knew I would be able to get in contact with. I figured Pat Riley would be more difficult. I wondered whether I would be able to get someone like Patrick Ewing. Some people still work for the team, like John Starks and Alan Houston. So the
Hmm.
Knicks are, I don't know that it's widely known in the media, but or if it's widely known in other countries, but the Knicks are not a team that some teams are very helpful if you want to speak with players, if you want to talk to their coaches, if you want to get in contact with people that used to play for the team several years ago or used to coach the team several years ago. Um, it's like anything where like certain teams are almost happy to do that for you
Yeah.
um, because they don't get that much attention. So smaller teams like the Indiana Pacers or um, the Sacramento Kings, they would probably be happy to help arrange interviews for you.
Mm.
Then there's teams like the Knicks who get so much attention already. A lot of times it's not attention for good things because they have not been very good over the last 20 years. But
hello,
they also
hello, James
they
Dolan.
right. They basically try to stop things from being written about by not participating and not helping.
I can
And
tell you that we contact Alan Houston, and he was all in to came to the show and talk with us, and it was the Knicks organization that say no. And we said we are only talk with Alan, with him as a player in the past. No, and there was no way.
so you hit the nail right on the head. Maybe even people in other countries know how difficult the Knicks can be about them using the media and being in the media. And I don't understand it. I mean, I'm not here to be to talk speak ill or to make fun of the Knicks or anything like that. They can do what they
Mm.
want. But I don't understand what what's bad about that, particularly for a team that has been so bad over the last 20 years. Um, when you're writing about the 90s or talking to players from the 90s, obviously those are only going to generate good feelings among the fan base. It actually gives people to talk about something that's positive instead of negative because the
The good
team has been
times.
poor. Right. And this book, obviously, it certainly talked about things that I'm sure certain players and certain people from those teams wish that I would not have written about their personal lives, about um, maybe affairs that they had with women, or about drug use, or anything else, death threats or whatever. But I was writing a book that was honest and was pretty complete, I think, about that era, and what made this team so special, and what made them so unique, and what I think why people love them so much, at least in New York.
Mm.
Um, so of course, when you have a period of 10 years where the team made the playoffs all 10 of those years, went to the finals for 2 of those years, went to the conference finals, I think either 4 or 5 of those years, and we're this close to winning a championship one of those times, of course, it's going to be a mostly positive book just because they were very, very good and positive during those years. And they were
Mhm.
interesting during those years, which you can't really always say that about them since then. You haven't been able to say that for most of the last 20 years. So I don't understand why they would be anti media or anti doing more media about those things to shed light on things that are more positive. Other than the only thing I can think of is that their owner
Yeah.
is not someone
Mm.
that likes media attention, is not someone, just basically someone that is relatively anti-media. And I think
Mhm.
it's weird because he's anti-media, but he's kind of obsessed with the media too. He kind of came up through the media. He ran one of his father's radio stations in Cleveland for several years. And obviously his father founded HBO. And
Yeah.
and Jim Dolan is the chairman of Cablevision. So it makes sense that he's obsessed with it, but I don't understand how or why he hasn't understood that the media, using the media sometimes, or at least being involved with the media, can be a good thing. when you're focusing on things that are relatively positive. Not all of it is negative, and it's a little bit strange to me that he hasn't that not he that he but that the team doesn't buy into that more. And I think especially for the 90s years, that was a great period of time for them, and it's really the only positive period of time that people your age, my
Yeah.
age, would really even remember.
Mhm.
Younger fans are just fans because they live in New York, and that's basically it. They don't have anything to draw from other than the 70s,
Mhm.
and if you're not looking at the 90s.
I highly recommend to the people that is listening to us to listen Shattered. It's a podcast about the dull and tenure of the Knicks. It's great, and it helps to understand his figure and the last years of the Knicks. And also, first you have to read Blood in the Garden. It's I wonder the first time when I saw in Twitter, I follow you in Twitter from years now, and I was thinking, I remember thinking, this guy isn't from Chicago. What is Chris doing a book about the Knicks? But after reading it, I think that is a important part of how good this book is that it's not a fan remembering the good times or the other way, telling the bad things of that. It's like a journalism exercise, very objective, and few times or maybe none you put that your opinion there. It's like, okay, listen, these are the facts, this is what happened.
Yeah, and I thought that was important. If you ever write a book, you'll have to tell me later whether you pay a lot of attention to the reviews, and there's different websites where people can rate what they thought of the book. There's a website called Goodreads. Obviously, there's Amazon. And some people are great and they don't pay any attention to that stuff. Maybe because I'm a first time author, I've paid attention. I read what people think. I think I read one comment where someone was saying, I really enjoyed the book, but it really, really needed more opinion in it. You know, the author was almost going to great lengths to not show his opinion. I'm a reporter, which doesn't mean that I can't give a pretty clear indication of whether something was against the rules or whether something was done in an underhanded fashion where someone was lying, or if someone, someone issues a death threat or someone is unfaithful to their wife. I'm putting all that in the book, but I don't need to tell you what I think of that.
Mhm,
To me, in my opinion, maybe because I'm a reporter and my job is to be objective in what I'm writing about anyway. Whether it's basketball, whether it's when I used to cover law or crime or politics,
mhm,
um, my job is to tell the truth and then to let the reader make of that whatever they want to make of that. You don't need to know whether it's something that I'm really angry about or whether it's something where I really hate a player or love a player, because like what difference does that make?
mhm,
So my job, especially for something I was not of age to have remembered any of this. I was barely old enough to have been alive for it. I was 4 years old when Pat Riley got hired. Um, so I was 8 when Pat Riley left, and by the time Jeff Van Gundy was there, at oldest, I was 10 or 11 years old during the years I was writing about. So I wasn't a Knicks fan. I didn't know anything about the Knicks and the Bulls. I was barely a Bulls fan, even though I grew up here. I didn't know anything about those teams. So writing about it and writing with a really firm opinion, I would only be developing an opinion off of what I was told anyway, not from what I saw or what I remember feeling. So my job is basically to just put people in the room.
mhm,
And basically, by that, I mean to recreate the scenes for everyone that's reading and to let you develop whatever opinion you want to once you know all the facts and all the
mhm.
things that were said and that were happening at the time and all of the necessary context. And it's kind of, you talk about being like a fly on the wall
Yeah.
so that you're aware of what happened. If I'm giving you all that, you should be able to kind of reach conclusions for yourself. I don't really need to do that for you. But that was all I wanted to do, was to recreate, just to show people what that time was like and what those things were like, what those people were like. And obviously I'm biased, but I think I did a pretty good job of that,
You
and
did a
was
great
able to
job.
get. Thank you. I think
You did
I've,
a
that
great
was the
job.
goal.
I'm not a journalist, but I'm very passionate about journalism, and that's why we spent like 20 minutes now talking about how do you made the book instead of what the book is about. Let's
Well,
talk
it
about.
could be. Let me say this, because it could be. I mean, it could be done a different way. There are plenty of books that are done differently. There's a book that came out maybe 2 or 3 months before mine called "I Wish It Lasted Forever." It's about the 1980s Celtics. So
Mhm,
it'd be the flip side of what you grew up watching with the Lakers.
yeah.
And there's an author named Dan Shaughnessy who wrote the book, who covered the Celtics at the time, and that was a much different time where players and the reporters would fly together and stay in the same hotel sometimes and hang out together on the road at bars or at houses, or just hang out on the road together. So he wrote the book from the perspective of someone that was kind of in the inner circle at the time with Larry Bird and Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale and all these other guys. That's different, and he wrote the book kind of through like a first person point of view of how fun a time that was and how different a time.
Mm,
um, I didn't have that perspective because that wasn't my experience. But also, I think that there's something to be said for writing something in, I guess, what you would call a down the middle fashion where you're not giving an opinion. I don't think there's a need for one there. If you're
mm.
part of it and if it's something that you lived out, then maybe you have a more informed opinion than I would have. So
We
everybody's
we
different.
have
Books can be written in different ways.
The Last Enforcer, the Charles Oakley book.
Yeah.
It's being out. I'm waiting for it. I ordered. I'm waiting
Yeah.
for it. I'm also waiting for Charles to ask if we will came to the show. But I guess it's a different point of view, knowing.
Very different. Very, very different. Yes.
Let's talk about the Knicks. It's like you say in the title is the 1990s Knicks. The flagrant history, maybe attached with that falls. Um, it all begins with Riley. It nearly ends with him. He's in the cover because for the half of the decade he was like the hero, and the other half of the decade he was like the villain. um
Right.
the other two guys that make NBAdictos with me, Sergio Gimon and Danny Egea, they are huge Knicks fans, and Danny is a huge Pat Riley fan. And
Okay.
meanwhile I was reading the book, I was telling him, I don't know if you want to read this. I don't know if you want to know better, because he's from Barcelona and Pep
Okay.
Guardiola. I don't know if you know soccer, but it's it's like two schools. The one that prefer playing beautiful, and the one that prefer playing effective. And Barcelona, Guardiola, Cruyff prefer to play beautiful, like Menotti in Argentina, and
Hmm.
Mourinho, Bilardo, and obviously Pat Riley going to play hard. So um,
Yes.
there is a lot of history behind the arrival of Riley to New York.
There's a ton of history, and I've heard people compare a little bit. They were saying, I've said that I'm going to try to do a second book, and people have been asking me what I was going to do, and people have mentioned Guardiola a couple times as kind of like a similar figure, just as far as the intensity and the idea that just kind of the different ways he goes about coaching, and how you're either going to love that coach or you're going to hate him, as far as the way fans perceive him. Um, Riley, I think Riley always had a little bit of a rugged kind of physical way that he wanted his teams to play, but the Lakers, as you mentioned before with Magic Johnson, they were so talented on offense that I don't think people saw how physical they could be and how kind of nasty they could be on defense.
Hmm.
But they had that, and Pat Riley wanted them to play that way. When he coached the Knicks didn't have that talent. They really didn't have much offensive talent at all outside of Patrick Ewing. So really Pat Riley leaned more heavily on the defense, and quite frankly, when Pat Riley was a player, that was the way he played because he wasn't
Yeah.
really that great on offense. He wasn't that big, he wasn't that good. So really the only thing he could do was really provide a lot of energy and play really hard on
It's
defense.
funny.
And
It's funny because it's like Phil Jackson in the Knicks.
yes,
He wasn't that talented, and he gave that energy and that fight from the bench.
exactly. And a lot of people make their name that way. And it's part of the reason that a lot of people say, one of the big debates here in the US, and I'm sure in other parts of the world where the NBA is popular, people have that question all the time about coaches and whether great players can make great coaches or not. Because great players,
Hello, Steve Nash.
exactly. And that was who I was talking about when I talked about last night, that conversation coming up. Whether or not they can kind of understand and really wrap their arms around what to get out of their players and how to get that out of their players, because for some of those superstars, it comes so easily for them that they don't really know how to coach well. Phil Jackson and Pat Riley were both okay players. They were both part of championship teams as players, but they probably understood how much hard work was necessary to really win at the highest level. And I think it probably is part of why Pat Riley was a great coach and why he coached the Knicks the way he did. But it surprised a lot of people to see the Knicks play a completely different style than the one the Lakers did. A team that had so much offense and some defense, to then coach a team that had really no offense and all defense, with Riley and in New York. And so that was really their identity. The other part of their identity was to be really, really nasty and to knock people over and to hit people. And that was something that Pat Riley told them he wanted them to do, to be
Mhm.
nasty, to intimidate other teams, to basically have better conditioning than all the other teams so that they could last longer in games and have more endurance at the end of games when teams get tired. But also to wear out and to tire out the referees with how
Mhm.
often that you would hit and foul other teams. Because if you do that a lot at the beginning of a game, the referees aren't going to call a foul every single time you do it, because the games would never end if they do that.
Eh,
So you're
There's
going to put them in a position where they've got to make a choice about what they're going.
Mhm. One of the best coaches in Europe, Aito García Reneses, that coached Barcelona. He discovered Pau Gasol, for example.
Mhm.
There was a time that he said they are only going to call like 10 fouls. Okay, let's do 20 because they are going to call 10.
Yes. Right. Exactly. It's a huge thing. I mean, like it doesn't matter until you start to see teams really going out of their way to challenge the referees, because if you just hit somebody, if you hit them like it's American football, of
Mhm.
course someone will call it a foul. But like you said, if there are people that have in their mind that they're only going to call 10 no matter what, after you get to 10, are you really going to stop doing that just because they've said they're only going to call 10? Like you should. That was what the Knicks did. They basically pushed the limit consistently to see
They
how
set the
far they
bar.
could take it.
They
They
set the
set the
bar.
bar, and they basically dared referees and officials to call fouls, to keep calling fouls, and
Mhm.
it made teams afraid of going to the basket against them, which really improved the Knicks defense because people were afraid. I mean, and I have quotes in the book. Michael Jordan doesn't quite use the word afraid, but he said that he worried about having his head taken off at one point during a series in 1992. Will Purdue, who played for that same team, those Bulls, said that he wouldn't call it fear, but he said at the same time, you did worry a little bit that the Knicks might take it too far and might hurt someone.
Mhm.
Being worried about that is basically a fear,
Yeah.
because it's going to make you think twice about how aggressive you're going to be on offense, and it's going to change the way you play offense. So that Knicks
Mhm.
team was very different. They pushed the limits and they set the bar in a way that
Mhm.
the NBA did not want.
You have to set the bar. I was thinking about that play in Sunday's night between Chris Paul and
Herb Jones.
Herb Jones.
Mhm,
That
mhm.
Chris Paul pushes Herb. Herb look at the referee and said, what the fuck? This is a foul. The referee makes with the shoulders like it's okay, and 5 seconds later, Herb did the same to Chris Paul, and then and Chris Paul
Knocked him down.
was playing. Yeah,
That was weird. I mean, we've seen a couple plays in the playoffs now where there was the play that happened, I think, in that same game with Jay Crowder,
yeah,
where I think that was the game where Jackson Hayes really just shoved and like high up, like up around his face, shoves Jay Crowder. It happened right in front of the referee. Nothing was called. And then later, when Jay Crowder responded, only then did they um, give Jackson Hayes a flagrant two. And then in that same game, like you said, Chris Paul shoved Herb Jones, and Herb Jones looked at the referee basically almost like to get permission to
yeah.
knock Chris Paul over. And then neither one of them got called, but they both happened right in front of officials. This is a way more physical postseason than I can remember in a long time. It's been
But
a
it's
little bit
curious,
ugly to
Chris.
watch.
It's
Yeah, it's
curious,
been
Chris, because in other games they're over calling. In
yeah.
it's strange. I think that the referees are being the worst of these playoffs. But let's see, let's see. Going back to the book, going back to the Knicks. Uh, there were a team that it barely doesn't exist. Is I don't know if funny is the the word, but now we are used the young people are used to the CBA of the players and the salary cap, those kind of contracts. But then in the 80s, in the early 90s, it was different. Some players signed like 7 8 years, and Patrick Ewing has a clause in his contract that he has to be in the top of the most paid players in the league, and his agent tried to do something that shocked me the first time I read it.
Yeah, he had a clause which it definitely does not exist now. I'm sure players would love if they could write their contracts up this way, but Patrick Ewing was a huge deal coming out of Georgetown at college, um, and his agent, taking advantage of that, wrote a clause in the contract to basically say if Patrick falls outside of the four highest paid players in the NBA, that we can tear his contract up and make him a free agent, basically, so that he can go get more money either from the Knicks or another
Mm.
team. But you have to keep him in the four highest paid players. And so, right at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of that run in '91, um, Patrick was the fourth highest paid. I think it was, can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, and I think maybe Hot Rod Williams. I think were the three guys.
Mm.
And Patrick was upset because the Knicks were such a bad team for the first 6 years of his career that his agent basically knew Patrick didn't want to play there anymore and was getting
His agent,
frustrated. And
David Falk, the
David
same agent
Falk, same guy that
as
represented Michael
Jordan.
Jordan.
Yeah.
Yes. So Patrick, I assume, told David Falk that I don't really want to play here anymore. Can you start working to get me out of here? Finding a legal way to get me out of here. So David Falk started looking at the clause that he'd written into the contract. The truth was Patrick was ranked fourth in salary in terms of how much money he made. But David Falk started looking at different ways that you could calculate the highest paid player. So Patrick was fourth in terms of his base salary, just how much he was being paid for that season. But there were different players that had other things in their contracts that you could, depending on how you looked at it, you could argue that
Mm.
they were paid more. So I think Larry Bird, for instance, had a big signing bonus that year. And David Falk was trying to argue that, well, because of Larry Bird's signing bonus, he's making more money than Patrick this year. So now he's fourth and Patrick is fifth. And now that means we can make Patrick a free agent and shop him around to different teams. And in another case, David Falk tried to argue he tried to get Chris Mullen's agent
Yeah.
to have Chris Mullin restructure his contract to get him paid more money that season and to take a little bit less money the next season so that Chris Mullin could pass Patrick Ewing. And by doing that, Chris Mullin was playing for the Warriors. By doing that, then the Warriors would be able to not only change Chris Mullin's contract, but then they would have enough money freed up to be able to sign Patrick Ewing if they wanted to once he became a free agent because he fell
Mhm.
out of the top four. So the Knicks were obviously not happy with the fact that Patrick Ewing was maneuvering, trying to get out of his contract, and they alerted the league to what was happening. They took the issue to court and found that Patrick was still the fourth highest paid player based on what the court had determined. So they were able to keep him, but Patrick still wanted to leave. It basically took Pat Riley sitting down and having a conversation with Patrick about what he saw as the Knicks' vision and what he thought the Knicks could do with Pat Riley as the coach, with Patrick Ewing as the star, and what they would do with the players around him.
Mhm.
Basically asking Patrick Ewing to give him a year or two to see if they could turn things around. And obviously they did. Um,
Mhm.
but that was a big moment for the Knicks because they almost lost Patrick Ewing. And at one point, when Pat Riley was negotiating with the Knicks, Pat Riley actually said, if you can't convince Patrick to stay, I don't want to come here and coach the team. So it was kind of important for both things to happen. I don't know that Patrick would have stayed if they had not gotten Riley. And I'm not completely sure Pat Riley would have been excited about coaching the Knicks if they had not had Patrick Ewing.
Mhm. If someone is wondering how the agents can could do that things, then they just have to dig a little bit in what Clutch Sports, for example, is doing nowadays, and
Great.
it's not changed so much.
It's just a little different, but it's you're right. There's a lot of similarities between finding ways to stretch the rules, and
Mhm.
again, like we said about the Knicks, pushing the limits and setting
Yeah.
a new bar.
Hello to Anthony Davis and the trade to the Lakers.
Right.
And then Patrick Riley arrives to the Knicks with a policy of with me or against me, and I know that you already talk about the SUV anecdote a lot, but I love it. Can you tell us?
Sure. Just the weirdest thing. I mean, Pat Riley at one point was sitting down. It was before a practice they had in 1991, and he was sitting in a room with the man who hired him, Dave Checketts, the president of the Knicks during that time. And Dave Checketts' wife called him to, I guess he knew that she was a car for the family,
Mhm.
an SUV. She wanted to get a Chevy Suburban. And so she was just calling Dave Checketts to ask, what color should I get? What color car should I get? And are you okay with the color? So at first she had talked about getting a green one, and Dave was on the phone and told her that would be fine. But Pat Riley was sitting right there and he could overhear parts of the conversation that Dave was having with his wife on his cell phone. And Pat Riley interrupted them both and said, Dave, you can't tell her that green is an okay color for a car. And Dave Checketts thought Pat Riley was kidding, but Pat Riley was very serious because he basically said green is the color that the Celtics wear. And in Pat Riley's world, someone that played with those Lakers teams um, in the 60s and 70s and and then had coached against them in the 1980s, green was like an evil color to him because that was the color the Celtics were. So
Yeah.
he was very serious about that. And once Dave Checketts realized he was being serious about it, um, he told his wife, actually, what other colors are there? Maybe we shouldn't get green. And so she then suggested another color. She said, how about red? And again, Checketts was fine with that. But again, Pat Riley was almost offended that Dave Checketts would even ask him whether red was an okay color because red is even worse because at this point, the Knicks are playing against the Bulls every year. So at that point, Checketts tells his wife, don't come home with anything other than a blue SUV. That's the only color that will work because Pat Riley was so, like you said, you're either for us or you're against us. He viewed the idea of getting a color car that was the color of an opponent as being a betrayal. And he told Dave Checketts that. And I think that line of thinking, the way he thought about that sort of thing, was the way he thought about a lot of things. And I think it really was part of the reason that he left the team, was that at a certain point, I think he did start to feel like certain people in the organization were not completely for him, which, based on the way he thought, meant that they had to have been against him.
Mhm. He through get that to the locker room, to the way he coached the team. He make a huge defensive team, and also there is a book called Jordan Rules talking about all that the Pistons made against Michael Jordan. We can do something similar with what Pat Riley's Knicks tried to do against Michael Jordan in his tenure in the Knicks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he made it very, very clear that he wanted to do the same thing that the Pistons had done. The Pistons won 2 championships using a really aggressive, borderline illegal style of defense to, again, intimidate Michael Jordan from wanting to come into the paint to score around the basket. It worked for a couple of years, basically when Michael was still pretty young and still kind of getting used to the physicality. Um, but eventually, Michael got in the weight room and basically said, I have to get stronger to play against a team like this because they're trying to hurt me. And he
Mhm,
did. And, as he got stronger, but also as he got more experienced, he learned how to play around it and how to kind of just um, basically to overtake the Pistons, as the Pistons were getting a little bit too old to really carry out that sort of defense anymore. So Pat Riley looked at that strategy and said, look, I don't think the strategy is a bad one. I think that really the thing is the Pistons were just too old at that point. Their players were getting too old. And he thought that based on the way the Knicks were built with the players they had, that was probably the best way to try to beat the Bulls, was to try to do what the Pistons had done with a younger group of players. And so the Knicks obviously had Ewing, who was not the most physical defensively, but he was still physical. Um, but obviously they had him, and they had Oakley, and they had Xavier McDaniel, and they had Anthony Mason. John Starks was very physical. So was Greg Anthony. And he rolled out that group of guys, and he told them during the 92 playoff series against the Bulls, at one point he told them to knock Michael Jordan down and just to hit him anytime he came into the paint. And Michael played scared, at least in one of those games. In game 6 of that series in 92, he played
mhm,
scared. After he had, I think, a 38-point game where everything came easy in game 5, where he's getting to the basket whenever he wanted to. In game 6, the Knicks basically were saying in the media that they were going to be way more physical with him. And Michael knew it. And so he settled for jump shots basically all throughout game 6. He took 25 shots, 22 of them were jumpers. He only came into the paint 3 times. And it was one of the worst shooting performances he'd ever had in the
mhm,
playoffs, because you got the sense that he was a little bit intimidated to go toward the basket. So the Knicks did not win that series, but that was kind of that series, and the one that came before it against the Pistons was kind of a sign of how the Knicks were going to be in the conversation every year. They were going to be the team that challenged Michael Jordan every year. They didn't quite have as much talent, and I think everybody can acknowledge that. But they had enough skill, and they had more than enough physicality to at least put themselves in the conversation and
mhm,
sometimes intimidate those Bulls. And they were right there. 93, they probably should have beaten the Bulls. Think about it this way: in 92, up until game 7, the Knicks were outscoring, out rebounding, out assisting, shooting a better percentage, averaging more points than the Bulls. And they were more aggressive than the Bulls. They had 6 flagrant fouls, and the Bulls didn't have any through the first 6 games of that series. So they were toe to toe with the Bulls. They were actually outplaying the Bulls through 6 games. In 93, they had a 2-0 lead on the Bulls.
mhm,
And then the Charles Smith play obviously happened, but they had every opportunity to win that series. Um, they in 94, obviously Michael retired and they went to the finals. And the same thing happened in 98 when Michael retired. The Knicks then went to the finals in 99. So they were pretty toe to toe with Michael through those years. And
mhm.
I think they were clearly the next best team, because every time Michael retired, the Knicks went to the finals immediately after. So
They
that was the goal.
they just didn't have Michael.
Right. And even without him, they got very close to they got about as close as any team did to
Mhm.
beating him. At least during those years where he won championships.
You talk about Anthony Mason, Xavier McDaniel, and that he made a Twitter account a couple of weeks ago. Follow him.
I
It's
saw that.
a lot of vintage content of NBA from the 80s and the 90s is great. X-Man. We talk about Charles Oakley, Pat Ewing, John Starks. Something that I loved about your book is that you not only talk about the player, but you talk about the person and the background. In the case of Anthony Mason, in the case of John Starks, Charles Smith, that mm, it, it can make us understand better all that goes in the court, because sometimes we saw the players like they are in the 2K in our PlayStation. No, you can't miss that that shot. But
Right.
sometimes there are a lot of things in their heads. And also you mentioned something that I think that is very important, is that Pat Riley get the psychologist out of the team when he arrives.
Yeah, yeah, that part stays with me still, just because if you're writing down a list of things that would not be allowed in today's NBA, particularly as so many people throughout the world struggle with mental health, particularly during a pandemic, the NBA has kind of had more of a campaign to get the word out about mental health, and focusing on mental health being a good thing. So you probably couldn't have a coach telling his team, or the people that employ him, that the team psychologist can't work with players anymore. So I don't know if that was a good thing. I know it was a different time. It was 30 years ago, so it's a little bit different now. But yeah, Pat Riley was telling them that. uh it was an interesting group of players, and a group of players that I think, if the Knicks were interesting on their own, they got close to winning championships several times during those years. Um, they almost beat Michael Jordan, which never happened during those years. So they were interesting for those reasons. They were in the biggest market in the country,
Mhm.
in New York, in the biggest city. So that made it interesting. But also the people on the team made them very interesting too. The style that they played with made them very interesting. So understanding how those players got to be the way they were, I think, is really important, just because um, they didn't just randomly become this team that wanted to play physically. They were a team that kind of had that in their personality already. For someone like John Starks, who had a tendency to go hot and cold in terms of how
Mhm.
well he was playing, that was not just something that happened in game 7. It also happened in game 1. It also
Yeah.
happened in maybe the 35th and 36th games of the season, where he would shoot 4 for 21 in one game and then shoot 16 for 21 in the next game. He did that all the time. Uh, you know, Anthony Mason being a difficult person to get along with did not happen with Pat Riley. He was always like that. And so outlining that and kind of spelling that out in a way for people to really dive into the characters and read about them and understand them better, I think was really, really important. Because if you can't understand who the characters are, you don't, again, as we talk about the different critiques that people may have of books, if you feel like you're not understanding who these people are, the people are half the story. The people that
Yeah.
make up the story are half the story. So if it's if you don't have the people and what really makes them tick and what makes them who they are, then it's just going to become a book that says, well, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And that's not interesting, because every team has a story of, what their season was like and how close they got. But if the people aren't interesting, then the book's not going to be interesting. So that was really important to me, to try to spell that out. Again, to talk to a lot of people around
Mhm.
the team, who were with the team, who were playing against the team, um, just to get a sense of who these guys were. I thought that was really important, and hopefully that came across in the book.
It's kind of curious to me that this way of thinking of Pat Riley, with me or against me, that sense of that fear of betrayal, uh, m- maybe made the Knicks lost the '94 finals. We can talk about Rolando Blackman if you want, but also it shocks me how he uh, betrayed the Knicks, talking with the Heat to go there. It's not coherent.
Yeah. Well, I'll go through the Rolando Blackman situation really quickly. I know that you asked me right before we jumped on, are you okay with talking about spoilers? And like I said, some people maybe haven't read the book, and that's fine. But at this point, I've written excerpts that are out on the internet if people have
Mhm.
read those or seen about those. So I'm not worried about that. Um, Blame me if you feel like I'm giving out a spoiler. But the part that we're talking about with Rolando Blackman is that obviously John Stark shot 2 for 18 in Game 7, which decided the championship in 1994. Pat Riley had every opportunity to take John Starks out. I get into why maybe he didn't want to do that. John Starks had been really great in games 4, 5, and 6. At the end of those games, he had double digit scoring in the fourth quarters. I think he had something like 11 and 14 and then 16 in games 4, 5, and 6 in the fourth quarter of those games. So he was really the only person scoring well for the Knicks in late game situations. Patrick Ewing really struggled against Hakeem Olajuwon. So Pat Riley had really developed a trust for John Starks because he'd basically become the team's best scorer in that series. But then after game 6 ended, with John Starks getting his shot blocked at the end of the game on a shot that would have won the Knicks a championship if it had gone in, John Starks really didn't sleep well. He was kind of traumatized by the way the game ended, and he kept replaying
And
that
we have
last
to
sequence.
remember, sorry, Chris, we have to
No,
remember
God.
that then the format of the finals, of the playoffs, was two home teams, home games for the best team first, then three on the road, and two with home court advantage. So between the game 6 and the game 7, the Knicks had to stay in Houston.
Very good point. I actually forgot to bring that up. So yeah, Starks was traumatized, and instead of being able to relax after the game, and then there were 3 days between games, but the Knicks were playing those. They were in Houston for those 3 days, 3 nights that they had to think about a really difficult Game 6 loss, which allowed the Rockets and their fans to build up more confidence when they tied the series back at 3 games apiece. But also, the Knicks are sitting in a hotel room with nothing to do and nowhere to go, really, because they are trying to just focus in. So the Rockets are in their own beds and in their own homes around their own families, relaxed and feeling good about Game 7. The Knicks just keep thinking about the way they lost Game 6. Starks thought about it more than anyone, and he really traumatized himself thinking about, to the point where he couldn't sleep before Game 7, and so he was really, really all over the place in Game 7. He was forgetting his defensive assignments and losing his man. Um, he was just really, really bad shooting it. The shots were missing by a foot and a half, and sometimes the last shot he took of the game might have missed by 4 feet.
Mhm.
So Pat Riley, in his mind, as he's struggling, as Starks is struggling, is trying to figure out whether to pull John Starks out of the game, but in his mind is thinking, well, he's been hot at the end of all the other games, so let me just leave him in the game. His other choices were Hubert Davis, who was really young. I think he was maybe in his second year, and everybody has basically said Hubert Davis looked pretty afraid of the moment just because he was a young guy and had not played
Mhm.
all that well in the series before that. So they didn't go to Hubert. But the other option that Riley had was Rolando Blackman, who was, I think, at that point 33 or 34 years old. He was a 4-time All-Star. He was the leading scorer in Dallas Mavericks history at that point. Before Dirk came along, he's still number 2 in Mavericks history in terms
Mhm.
of scoring. Um, and he was a player that, for his career, of all the teams in the league, he shot best field goal
Yeah.
percentage wise against the Houston Rockets, who were obviously in the same division, and he
His
averaged the
favorite,
most points against the Houston
his
Rockets.
favorite rival.
Yeah, I mean, he killed them, and there were players on the Rockets bench during that game. So I talked to Scott Brooks, who's probably known for being
Mhm.
the Oklahoma City and more recently the Wizards head coach. He was a member of those Rockets teams, and he said, "Chris, I was petrified that they were going to bring in Rolando Blackman because Rolando, for all those years he was in Dallas, he just killed us every time he played against us. We had no answer for him, and he knew how to beat us. And so we kept thinking that Riley was going to do that, but we were thrilled. The longer he left John Starks in the game, the more John Starks' shots were missing by. So when I asked around about why Rolando Blackman never got an opportunity, Rolando told me when I interviewed him for the book that really what it was, or at least what he wonders whether it was, is that he got into a disagreement with Pat Riley. And again, this is the all or nothing, you're either with me or against me, Pat Riley, that he questioned Pat Riley about why the team couldn't bring their wives on the trip to Houston, why they couldn't fly their wives down to Houston or fly down with their wives to Houston for the NBA Finals, because none of these players on the Knicks roster had ever won a championship. None of them had even been to the finals, I don't think.
Mhm.
So this was a big achievement for them to get that far. Keep in mind the Knicks
And
had played
also,
two.
sorry,
Go ahead.
sorry, Chris. Also,
Mhm.
we have to look the years before. It's not that they appeared like, I don't know, the last year Atlanta Hawks. They are in the conference finals and they reached the finals. No, they've been knocking at the door for 3 consecutive years, and
Right.
then they achieve it.
Right. And this is an older team that's starting to get to be an older team, where Patrick Ewing at this point is what, probably 32, 33 years old.
Mm.
And so it's not a team that, is going to have obviously we know now was not going to be a team that had a whole lot of opportunities to just keep getting there. So anyway, they wanted to bring their wives. Rolando Blackman is a really respected veteran who's accomplished more than basically anybody else on the roster other than Patrick. And Riley just tells him, no, we're not bringing wives. You guys can't bring your wives on the trip. And after Riley says no, Rolando asks again in front of the whole team. And he says, I don't get it, Pat. Like, why would you not let us bring our wives? It's a huge achievement. We've been away from our families for most of the season at this point. We've been through 2 7-game series already to this point. The Knicks would end up playing more playoff games that year than any team in NBA history with
Mhm.
25. So it was a long season for them. And, to Rolando's point, he was basically saying, our wives hold our families together while we're on the road so much. This was kind of a slap in the face to them and for us, quite frankly, to say that you don't trust us to bring our wives on the road to not be a distraction. So Riley again just said no, and he was agitated that Rolando would challenge him and question him in front of the team like that. So Rolando, and not just Rolando, but Doc Rivers, Charles Oakley, um, Derek Harper, who was very good friends with Rolando because they'd played together in Dallas before, all said that they wondered and still wonder to some extent whether that argument had something to do with why Pat Riley didn't bring Rolando into the series and why he didn't play him in that moment, in that sequence, when John Starks was struggling that badly. And it doesn't mean that Pat had to play Rolando for the whole fourth quarter. He could have put Rolando in for 2 or 3 minutes just to try
Yeah,
to refocus John Starks or to get him to take a
get
breath
some breathe.
a little
To,
bit.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and he didn't do that. And so again, I don't necessarily think that's why Pat Riley didn't play Rolando. I think he probably just really trusted John Starks. He had a history of playing really short rotations in the playoffs anyway. And Rolando had not played a whole lot before that series, even before the argument. He had not played a ton in the playoffs leading up to that. So I tend to think that it was just that he trusted John most. But the fact that a third of the team, 4 players, said that they think that might have been a factor. And then I think also that Pat Riley has made a point to write Rolando basically what I think could be perceived as apology letters, handwritten apology letters for not putting him into that series. Um, and he's called it the biggest mistake of his career, not putting
Mhm,
Rolando in. I think it was worth including in the book that so many players thought that Pat Riley might have that as personality to hold that grudge. Again,
mhm.
I don't think that's why Pat held him out, but I think that again, it was not about what my opinion was. It was about being a fly on the wall and including what everybody else thought. And I think it's fascinating that people thought that. You asked one other question, I think, about Pat Riley and being so surprised and how out of character it was for him to be talking to the Miami Heat.
Yeah.
That's why, to your question from before about explaining who these people were and what their priorities were and the for us or against us, that's why it was so interesting that he did that and why it's so important to really paint a full picture of how staunch Pat Riley was about, um, I guess if you want to call it fidelity and kind of being true to a vision and being true to your team and not fraternizing with the opponent. It was almost unthinkable that Pat Riley would do that. But as I mentioned earlier in the book, and as Pat mentioned in his own book, which was called The Winner Within, he
Mhm.
had a chapter called The Disease of Me, where he talks about kind of one person's importance being more important than everybody else's, the collective team's importance and the collective team's desires. And I think in that situation, he put himself before the team by basically kind of at least expressing an interest in coaching somewhere else and having a different situation in Miami at a time where the Knicks had him under contract, at a time where the Knicks were in the playoffs. Quite
Mhm.
frankly, that he had someone, he more or less had someone that he knew could negotiate a deal for him in
It's
Miami while he was in the middle of the contract with the Knicks, which was, it was selfish, but at the same time, I think most of us, I think myself included, probably would have done the same thing if I could have gotten that much more money, if I felt
but
like I
Chris,
could build the same thing. Mhm.
is inconceivable. Just imagine that Jeff Van Gundy did that, being
Yeah.
assistant. Pat Riley maybe could kill him on the floor.
Right. Pat Riley didn't even like his assistant coaches going to go golf. He thought that was a distraction. So the idea that Pat Riley would, as I mentioned in the book, talk with Mickey Arison, even just for a few minutes after the team had a shoot around. Mickey Arison had just bought the team and he was
Mhm.
the sole owner of the team. So he could give out 10%, 20% of the team if he wanted to, in a way that the Knicks could not just hand that sort of ownership over to Pat. So Pat was talking to him for 2, 3, 4 minutes before the team left after a shoot around in Miami to go back to their hotel. It was unthinkable that that would happen. It was then unthinkable that Pat Riley would allow his friend to have conversations with Mickey Arison about the possibility of Pat coming down there to coach. And then, within the same day that the Knicks were knocked out of the playoffs in 95 by the Pacers, Pat Riley re-engaged that conversation and had his friend basically talk more with Mickey Arison about the
Mhm.
possibility of having him come coach there while he was still under contract with the Knicks. And
Mhm.
so again, that's a situation where I did not really invoke my
Mhm.
opinion. I don't think I need to. It's pretty black and white as to what happened there. I think we know what happened. Pat Riley has said that he did not really do that by the book, that he understands why fans are upset. I've said, if I am invoking my opinion, I've said a few times now that I don't think Pat Riley would have lasted much longer with the Knicks anyway. Maybe he could have coached for another year or two. But I think that the team was kind of getting older. I think the players were
Yeah,
starting to get a little
but
bit tired of him as a
Chris,
coach.
is for me is not that that is not the important point. For me is that if you are telling all the time how loyalty, fidelity is important for you, you have to
Yes,
be the same.
you can't
You
be
have
critical
to
at
set
that
the
point.
bar for the rest of the people, and you have to go from for that bar. Um,
Good
then
point.
he goes to the Miami Heat. Don Nelson coached the Knicks for like 15 minutes, and then please read the book. The Don Nelson history, I mean, also is worthy. And Jeff Van Gundy, I have to recognize that. Um, I told you before that I started to read the book, and Pat Riley began to seems like a worst and worst character for me, and it happened the other way around with Jeff Van Gundy, because Jeff Van Gundy for me when I was 19 in the 99 finals. Um, remember the lockout season, that
Sure.
finals with Greg Popovich and Jeff Van Gundy playing like I don't know 50 points games, and
Yeah.
for me it's like the devil, the opposite of the basketball I liked, and reading the book is like and I really like this guy. I also have fond of him listening in Sackler's the Low Post. Whenever he goes, I really like him. And you tell some stories and some things. For example, that he lived in the college. He started to coach, and it's like the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think. I think there's certain things with him. He first of all, he developed a lot of his beliefs from Pat Riley, from having coached under Pat Riley, and I make it clear in the book that Pat Riley, even though Jeff was not the top assistant at the time, that Jeff was the assistant that I think Pat Riley began to bring closest to him because he knew Jeff wanted to be a head coach someday too. So, I mentioned in the book that Pat Riley ends up being really when Jeff has his first child, he names her, he gives her middle name Maddie. Her middle
Mm,
name was Riley.
yeah.
Um, that obviously was because of Pat. So Jeff swore by Pat Riley. I mean, he basically took him under his wing a little bit to some extent. And Pat does not do that with many people. I think Eric Spoelstra is maybe one of their only examples that he's really done that with. But he took people under his wing, and he took Jeff under his wing, and kind of showed him the way to start preparing to be a head coach someday. And when Jeff did it, he was the youngest head coach in the league. Um, but I don't. I feel like I have a lot more in the book about how Pat became the way he was than I do about Jeff. But what I do think is made very clear in the book is kind of how Jeff Van Gundy became a really beloved figure in New York. Because I think New York likes to see itself, at least a big portion of the city likes to see itself as an underdog, as baller, as
Mm,
hardworking. Like you said, Jeff Van Gundy, when he worked at Providence, um, was parking at the university. He basically had no apartment when he first started working there. He saw that the basketball team that he coached had a basketball facility and had a basketball office that had nice couches and had a really nice shower and had a dressing room for the coaches. He just started living there, and everybody thought that he was leaving the office at at 9 o'clock at night and then coming back at 5:30 in the morning. No, he was just living there. His car stayed there in the parking lot in the same spot every day.
it's funny
And
because you tell that a partner of him came at 6 a.m. and Jeff is right here. The next day, 5:30, Jeff is right here. 5 in the morning, Jeff is right here. Yeah, Jeff didn't left.
yeah, yeah, I mean, and that's how he was. And so I think he probably it probably came across as like Jeff never sleeps, and I'm sure there was probably some truth to that. It was probably more realistic that Jeff was probably also somewhat cheap. Like the guy drove pretty cheap cars considering how much money he made. But I think it was also a way for him to save money. But either way, the fact that this was a guy that literally never left the facility, a guy that we saw the dark circles around his eyes, that you could tell he hadn't slept much when he was coaching, that he would rewatch games 3 and 4 times to try to watch film. Uh, he was a really hardworking coach that, like everybody else, was going to work really hard. He fit the Knicks perfectly. The Knicks were a
Mhm.
team that was going to try to outwork everybody and try to just kind of intimidate you with how hard they worked and how hard they played. Jeff was the coaching version of that.
and,
He
and
was a
and they
Riley
develop
protege.
develop a rivalry. Maybe the strongest rivalry in the 90s between the Heat and the Knicks. They cross in the playoff for several years. Riley being in the Heat, former Nick coach, and also the fights. There was a lot of things, and at the end it ends similar because he went to the finals. He also loses the finals, It's like parallel histories.
Yeah, it was really strange, like to consider. I think anybody, if you ask them like who's the better coach, the more successful coach, anybody would say Pat Riley. I think it's always a little bit. First of all, Pat Riley won 4 championships with the Lakers. He didn't win one with the Knicks, but became this close to winning one with the Knicks. He obviously won one as the coach with Miami, and then won two more as the team's president. Um, so he's got more championships basically now than he's got, uh, almost more than he's got fingers when you consider how many championships he's won as a player, as an assistant coach, as a head coach, as a president, whatever. So
Yeah,
everybody would say Pat Riley.
sorry,
He's a Hall of Famer. Go ahead.
sorry, Chris. I don't know if it is a urban legend, but it's told that when he wants to recruit the free agents to the Heat, he just go to his office and put all the rings in the desk, and I
Yeah,
don't
in
know.
a
I
little
don't have
bag.
nothing to say. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Bosh has said that, and I think LeBron has talked about it a little bit too. I mean, which is it's like a Godfather sort of move. Like very few people can do that. Phil Jackson maybe could do that, but Phil has never really seemed to relate with players as well as Pat Riley does. I think there's always been more of a cool factor with Pat Riley than there's been with Phil. So he's always been able to do that. But if you just look at each guy head to head. Pat Riley had the better years as far as how many games they won
Mhm.
each season than Van Gundy, but Jeff Van Gundy had an older version of those teams. Uh, so the fact that Jeff Van Gundy took that team and got them to a finals, and that he survived. Like Pat Riley was never going to be fired by the Knicks. If anything, they were trying to give him the most money to convince him to stay when he didn't want to. Jeff Van Gundy had the polar opposite history, where every year it was thought that he was in danger of losing his job.
Mhm.
Nobody knew who he was compared to all the people that probably wanted that job. Chuck Daly was in conversation for that job. Don
He
Nelson,
also
when he
he also
retired,
had
was
to deal. He also had to deal with Dolan.
he had to deal with Dolan a little bit at the very end of that process. Don Nelson had, up until a couple weeks ago, was the winningest coach of all time. Chuck Daly was someone that had been up for the job at one point before they hired Don Nelson. So, and Phil Jackson wanted to be, included in the conversation for this job at one point. So, everybody's trying to take this job away from Jeff. He fends that off. He fends off the fact that Patrick Ewing shatters his wrist. He fends off the fact that the team has changed completely overnight.
Mhm.
He fends off all the injuries with Charles Sprewell, Marcus Camby, Patrick Ewing's Achilles, um, and he makes this team work. He gets past a Larry Johnson injury and knee sprain to make it to the 99 with the lockout and everything else, and all the distractions, all the locker room distractions they had in 99, and the
Mhm.
distractions about Jeff Van Gundy being on the chopping block and on the hot seat, and he takes them to a finals. And not to mention, he plays Pat Riley and the Heat 4 times in 4 years in the playoffs. They win 3 of those series. And the one that they didn't win was one where the
Mm.
Knicks had half their team suspended
Yeah.
because they came off the bench, including Patrick Ewing, John Starks, Allen Houston. So, they very easily could have won all 4 series that they played against Pat Riley.
Yeah.
They never did win a championship. They only made it to one finals during those 4 years that I wrote about under Jeff. But that's a real accomplishment. And I don't even think you could really argue that Pat Riley did a better job with his teams. And his teams had probably a little bit more talent than the Knicks. They had a younger Alonzo Mourning, Tim Hardaway, and they had Dan Marley and a bunch of other role players. That was probably a little bit better than what the Knicks had, considering how old they were at the time. So, Jeff Van Gundy, he's a guy that people may get annoyed with him, and some of the commentary, they might get annoyed with him because he obviously is very friendly with Tom Thibodeau, and Knicks fans seem to, at least some Knicks fans, seem to have kind of turned on Tom Thibodeau over the last year. But no one will ever question like how loyal Jeff Van Gundy is to the Knicks. He loves the team. When we talk Pat Ewing or Pat Riley talking about the mistake he made with Orlando Blackman, Jeff Van Gundy considers his biggest mistake as a coach being the fact that he resigned when he did. as the coach in 99, or I'm sorry, in 2001, as
Mhm.
abruptly as he did, where he felt like the pressure was getting to be too much, that he needed to spend more time with his family. He's called that a regret because he loved, just it was rare, the kind of love that he got from New York fans. New York fans generally, especially if you don't win a championship, they're impatient.
Mm.
They want to win every year. But I think they also realize when they're kind of overmatched and underdogs. And Jeff Van Gundy was like the quintessential underdog for a team like the Knicks. And to survive that atmosphere and to be as beloved as he is still, I think speaks volumes. And he's thought about in a way that a lot of New York fans hate Pat Riley. I don't think
Mhm.
they are capable of hating Jeff Van Gundy.
I think he deserves more credit than Pat Riley for all the reasons you just say.
Wow.
Uh, I think he deserves more credit. It's not the same that saying he was a better coach. He wasn't. But I think in Nick's tenure, he deserves more credit than Pat Riley had. Chris,
I'm
thank you
not
very
sure. I
much.
don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I wouldn't disagree with you, but
Mhm.
I think Riley deserves credit for putting his stamp on the team, because by the time Jeff Van Gundy was coaching, he was continuing on what Pat set in motion 5 or 6 years earlier, or 4 or 5 years earlier. And the Knicks were just not interested good for the 10 years that came before. I guess they were good for 2 of those years, but they weren't good
Yeah,
during the 80s. So I think it's hard to get the ball rolling. And,
but
but he
Chris,
did that very quickly.
I always put the same example. If we go to
Uh-huh.
the Memphis Grizzlies, the first step was made by Pau Gasol and that team that go first to the playoffs for the first
Yes.
time of the team, and
Yes.
then Marc Gasol, Sibo, Mike Conley take the team to the conference finals. Uh,
Hmm.
we have to get credit for both of them, but in this case, for me, it's the other way around. I think that Pau Gasol's teams were worse than the Mike Conley, Zach Randolph, Marc Gasol teams, and also did something more difficult as is getting the first step. In the case of the Knicks, I realized that Pat Riley make that first step. He now we always say that hit culture. He put that
All
culture
right.
in the team. But for me, is you said it before. He never was on the line. He have his job secure. He was the huge coach that won 4 rings with the Showtime. That was more than a team. But Jeff, he was sorry to say that. Understand me? He was nobody, and there was always vultures wanting his seat, and his team was older. He has a lot of changes. They brought him Marcus Camby that he didn't like. Um, a
Right.
lot of things that for me deserve more credit. Not that Pat didn't deserve it, but Jeff, I
Yeah, I
think
hear
that
you.
deserves more credit.
Yeah, I hear you. It's an interesting take, but the fact that you can even have that conversation or really have that debate speaks to how good this team was. That
Mhm.
Pat Riley might not have even been your best coach during the 1990s. Like I said, I think it's debatable, but the fact that you could have that conversation, that you had two coaches that were both there for, I guess, at least the 4 years that Pat was, and then Jeff was there for 5.5 or 6. That's I mean, it's hard to find a team that has a decade that good
Mhm.
without winning a championship, and I think that's what made this team so unique. Between that and the characters they had, it was just a really unusual time for a city and for a team that has been horrible since. And I think that that's
Mhm.
part of what's made them so interesting too. If they'd won 2 championships since then I don't think that, that it resonates the same way. But it's been
Mhm.
49 years. It'll be almost 50 years since they've won a championship.
Yeah.
It'll be 50 years next year if they don't win. It's been almost 25 since they've been back to the finals, and they've won fewer games. They've fired more coaches. They've won fewer playoff series than any team in the NBA since then. So,
Mhm.
who knew that was, that they had it so good back then, and
Mhm.
kind of how far things
Yeah.
would fall with Jim Dolan in charge.
We have a lot of stories about that 1990s Knicks in Blood in the Garden. We are waiting for the translation in Spanish. We know that a lot
I
of
hope so.
listeners
Mhm.
ask us about this. We will dub this interview and publish it in Spanish. And also for the Knicks fans, as I said before, when you finish Blood in the Garden, take Shatter It, that podcast that tells the Dolan in tenure with the Knicks. It's great. Chris, we read you in Sport Illustrated. We listen you sometimes with Zach Lowe in the low post. Are you planning to write another book, another team, another great team? You go to do something similar, or maybe you're looking other way around and you make this and now you need something different.
Yeah, no, I'm writing another book. I'm not supposed to say what it is just yet, but without trying to be annoying about, it's about another team. It's about a team that's taken place since then. So I am going to do that. I was thinking about a couple teams. I was thinking about the team that struck me as most similar to those Knicks teams as far as fun personalities, a history of winning during those years, but then struggling afterwards was the Sacramento Kings. I thought about for a while, and
Oh.
maybe doing a book about them and those 2000 era Sacramento Kings with Chris
you,
Webber and how close
you
they
can do
got
a
to
book.
beating.
You can do a book only about the series with the Lakers in '02.
Exactly. I mean, so I thought about that. They have the same sort of tortured history that the Knicks have had. I chose not to do that. Part of me thought about maybe doing a book on Riley himself, just him, because he's had
Mhm.
such an interesting career spanning from really the 60s, even when he was a college player, and the history that he had, playing in the national championship game, playing for a coach who was a racist, and playing against an all black team in the national championship game in the 60s, to then playing, in the NBA and playing for the Lakers alongside Wilt Chamberlain and alongside Jerry West in that
Mhm.
rivalry, coaching in the 80s and coaching Magic Johnson and the Showtime Lakers then, coaching against Michael Jordan in the 90s, and then all the stuff with the Heat after that, including LeBron and Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. He's had a crazy, crazy career, which who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe they win a title this year and it stretches on. He's been involved in the game for 7 decades at this point.
Yeah.
So you can tell a lot of NBA history through him. So I thought about writing a book just about him. So I ended up deciding to write about another team that's happened since the 1990s. I'm not supposed to say exactly what it is yet,
Don't say
in
it. Don't
part
say it.
because I
Don't
don't
say
want to. I don't want to tip off too many people that I may need to call for it, and then have them shut
it.
what I'm doing
Don't
down.
say it.
But I
We
am
will
going to
follow
do another
you.
book,
We will follow
and I'm
you
hoping that
at
this
the
is
right
going to
time.
become a. I'm hoping that in the meantime, as I'm working on that, that the Knicks book will be made into a docu series. I have a pretty good indication that that will happen at some point. We're just trying to finalize some of those things, but I do think that we'll have a docu series on it sometime, and then fortunately, we will be able to, even if we can't have the book made, put into Spanish and in other languages. Obviously, a docu series or a documentary would be at the very least dubbed, so that people could listen to it and watch it, and hopefully enjoy it that way if they don't read
I'm
the
gonna
book.
be a bad guy. I'm gonna be a bad guy. Don't let Adam McKay do a TV series of your book.
You're not a fan of Winning Time, huh?
I hate it. I hate it. I'm with Karim. I'm with Jerry West because
Yeah,
I love that Showtime team. I read everything that was published about them. I watched every documentary, and in his Substack, Karim the other day said that is not a characterization. Is they are making just caricatura, just
caricatures.
taking,
Mhm.
yeah, taking one trace of a person and make it all about that. And it's for me it was infuriating how they treated Jerry West, and and I don't like Iron McKay. Well,
Yeah, everybody's different. I mean,
mm,
we'll see what happens. I think there's been some interest in somebody building something scripted on the
mm.
book. For now, I think it's more likely that we see a docuseries. I don't know that the Knicks to everybody would be interesting enough. Like they didn't win a championship. They didn't really have huge personalities the way that those Lakers teams did,
Chris,
or like someone like a Jerry West or Kareem or Magic. Ewing was a quieter guy. So I think we'll have a docuseries. I know there are some people that have been asking my agent about the
mm,
potential of making a
Chris,
scripted series and if they could buy the
they
rights
are
and
the
stuff like that.
Knicks. They are the Knicks. There always is going to be people interested in that,
Hopefully.
and
Yeah.
it's a great book, and you have to do that documentary. Thank you very much, Chris. We said that like an hour is like an hour and a half. Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure. I'm a huge fan of your work, and whenever you want, this is your house.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, buddy. I appreciate it, and keep up all your great work. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos. Nos volvemos. Ya sabéis, tendréis la entrevista traducida y doblada en breve en iVoox, iTunes, Spotify. Nos vemos. Un saludo.